Hi everybody and welcome back to the channel. I've been thinking about doing this video for quite some time, so I figured, hey, this week, it's finally the time. It's become an interesting thing in terms of a way to rank people or things, and everybody understands it as soon as they hear it. Who would be on your fill-in-the-blank Mount Rushmore? Well, today is going to be my director's Mount Rushmore. Who's on it and why? Tough one to choose because there are so many great directors out there historically still working today. Man, how the heck do you narrow it to 4? So I've decided to kind of, as a way to do this, kind of follow the reasons why those faces are on the real Mount Rushmore. Okay, who is there and why are they there? Well, in that first most prominent spot is George Washington. Why is he there? Right? He's the GOAT, the greatest of all time, the guy who set the standards, who simply did the job better than anybody who's ever done it since and laid the groundwork. There's no challenging his body of work. That's what I'm going to have in my slot for number 1. Who's next to Washington? It's Thomas Jefferson. Well, who was Thomas Jefferson? Why was he so important? Well, he was an unbelievable mind, a Renaissance man. He could do everything, and he did it for a long time. He wasn't just president, right? He founded a university. He was a farmer. He was a great thinker. He wrote the Declaration of Independence. He could do anything, and he never lost his game. All right, well, I'm going to try to apply that to my list here. Who's in that third spot, which is, I've always thought of it as the one on the far right, which is Abraham Lincoln. Well, why is he there? Well, he saved the Union. He burned so bright, so fast, right? He came in with such intensity and did an incredible job over a short amount of time, and then was lost to history because of his tragic assassination. But just this unbelievable job in this very short period of time, burning brighter than perhaps anybody had ever before in that kind of span. All right, I'm going to try to apply that to my list here. And finally, who's that 4th spot of Mount Rushmore? Well, it's Teddy Roosevelt. Who was he? Well, he was the young upstart who showed so much promise, who could be shoulder to shoulder with these guys as the greatest of all time, if just simply given the opportunity. And his track record as a young man was so terrific, so magnetic. So I'm going to try to apply that to this list. So all of that said, let's get right to it and unveil the first slot. And I guess people who have watched my videos and are familiar with the channel, this probably isn't going to surprise anybody, because that first slot is going to go to Stanley Kubrick. All right, Stanley is the George Washington of directors. In my mind, the undisputed GOAT, the guy whose body of work is really beyond question some of the greatest films of all time in a variety of genres. The smartest guy to ever do this, with the possible exception of Orson Welles, and the guy who, once he hit his stride, just made masterpiece after masterpiece after masterpiece. And it's that skill and intelligence and focus and dedication to craft and perfection that just makes him stand above everybody, right? His body of work, when you think about it, 2 of the greatest anti-war movies ever made, if not the greatest anti-war movies ever made, in Paths to Glory and Full Metal Jacket. Arguably the greatest, certainly a handful of greatest of the sword and sandal epics in Spartacus, and that wasn't even his project. That's the one and only time that he came in as a director for hire, a gun for hire. And even with that in mind, he took over for Anthony Mann and made one of the great historical epics ever with Kirk Douglas. And then of course that leads to Dr. Strangelove, the greatest satire of all time, 2001: A Space Odyssey, and for my money, the second greatest film of all time behind Citizen Kane, certainly the greatest science fiction movie ever, followed by A Clockwork Orange, which is another candidate for one of the great satires ever made. Brilliant film, followed by Barry Lyndon, arguably the most beautiful film ever made, a Gatsby-esque story about a social climber. and just amazing, followed by The Shining, perhaps the most enigmatic movie ever made. The theories abound about what Kubrick is doing there and what it all means. Absolutely mesmerizing, followed by Full Metal Jacket, as I said, one of the great anti-war movies ever made. Brilliantly split to represent the split in the kind of the human psyche. And then capped by Eyes Wide Shut, which has only gained stature over the past quarter century, and rightfully so. One of the great meditations about marriage and insecurity and paranoia. Just amazing. I can't ever say enough about Stanley Kubrick. I could wax poetic forever, but I'm going to leave it at this, right? I'm just going to leave it here. He's the best. He's the GOAT, period. All right, so who's in that next slot? That Jefferson slot, the Renaissance man who just could do everything and did it over the course of a lifetime. For me, that slot is Steven Spielberg. Okay, Spielberg has been making high quality, amazing films for more than a half century with, I think, acknowledged fall off from where he was in his prime. But Steven Spielberg has never in his life made a movie that was unwatchable. Even the worst of his films are still watchable to a degree, some more than others. And even those movies that some people, including myself, deem unwatchable almost, right? The worst of his films have a devoted following, right? I think for my money, his two worst movies are 1941 and Hook. But even 1941 has its moments, it's beautifully made, got a great cast that turned in some really good performances. Hook, I think, is far and away his worst movie, but that has a very devoted following, and at moments it's amusing until it gets way too silly and it's way too obviously shooting on a sound stage, and it's just not my cup of tea. But it's not unwatchable. It's not terrible. He's just, if it says his name on it, directed by, you know it's worth seeing. And I've seen every Steven Spielberg movie he's ever made, and I will continue to do so up to and including the one he's got coming out this summer. And his movie Jaws changed my life forever, right? That movie made me fall in love with movies, and it's just one of the great classic thriller action movies of all time. Changed the way that movies are marketed and distributed, and it's held up as the benchmark for what you're striving for in that genre. For a half century now, more than a half century now. So yeah, Mr. Spielberg, we could go on and on about his great movies, right? Beyond Jaws, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Raiders of the Lost Ark, E.T., The Color Purple, Schindler's List, Jurassic Park, etc., etc. He hasn't had a really big, highly regarded film here for a while. I know The Fabelmans got some pretty good reviews and some award nominations. I wasn't as crazy about it as others, but hey, never count this guy out, ever. And I'm looking forward to his movie this summer. All right, so who's in that number 3 Abraham Lincoln spot? The person who burned so bright, so importantly, but for a brief span. For my money, that slot goes to Francis Ford Coppola, okay? Now, it's not that Coppola had some sort of tragic end and stopped making movies. He's been making movies for about 6 years, if you count Dementia 13. He's been making movies for a long time. But his peak and where he was at the top of his game and just churning out unbelievable masterpieces, that was a relatively brief period. But that brief period, like Lincoln's presidency, outshined everybody else and has made this indelible mark in history. You think about it, it is unbelievable. From 1972 to 1979, he releases 4 movies, all of which are regarded as flat-out masterpieces, right? And not only flat-out masterpieces, you can make a very strong case that 3 out of the 4, The Godfather, The Godfather Part 2, and Apocalypse Now, are all among the top 15 movies ever made. Ever made. I contend that The Godfather Part 2 is arguably the 3rd greatest movie of all time, behind Citizen Kane and 2001: A Space Odyssey. I think it surpasses the original. And the original is unbelievable. The original is incredible, right? Apocalypse Now, I would also put in the list of the 10 greatest movies ever made. Unbelievable cerebral meditation upon the dark heart of man, right? Influenced by Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Incredible. Don't want to forget about the fourth film either, right? 1974's The Conversation, distributed and released the same year as The Godfather Part 2. And it was overshadowed by that work, which went on to become Best Picture. And The Conversation, while slow, certainly by today's standards, it's a masterpiece. It's brilliant. And one of Gene Hackman's great performances. The unfortunate sad thing is that after that 7-year span, Coppola doesn't do anything that comes anywhere close to those movies ever again. That's the tragedy of kind of his career, is not that it ended, is, literally, it's just that it ended in its greatness and impact. It's really sad. Did he never make any good movies after that? Of course not. He made Rumblefish, The Outsiders, which are based on those S.E. Hinton novels, which are really well done, very highly regarded. Tucker, the Man in His Dream with Jeff Bridges, which I think is a really fun, well-made movie. The Rainmaker with Matt Damon, which I think is far and away the best films based on the John Grisham novels. Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is just unbelievable to look at, and it's one of the great horror movies of all time. It's certainly for my money, the best Dracula movie of all time. So even when he's out there just doing things to make money after he's lost it, because he's been such a kind of a terrible businessman through the years. So when he's doing stuff for hire, like Dracula and The Rainmaker, he's still making great movies. They're just not great and lasting works of art the way that those movies were in the 1970s. But Francis Ford Coppola dominated the 1970s, which, again, I believe is the single greatest decade for film in history. So one man clearly and totally dominated the single best decade for film. There's no way you leave that guy off of Mount Rushmore, right? So I got to slot him here. So who's in that coveted fourth slot? Well, if we're talking about young upstarts with unbelievable promise who can eventually kind of rub shoulders and stand shoulder to shoulder with these guys, who is it? Well, for my money, that person is Paul Thomas Anderson, who I think is clearly and beyond measure the greatest director of Gen X, right? I think the only person who can even begin to give him a run for his money is Christopher Nolan. But I'll take Paul Thomas Anderson's filmography any day over Christopher Nolan's, who I like. I just don't think he has near the body of work, a track record, and the brilliance of Paul Thomas Anderson, who really strives for and damn near succeeds in making a masterpiece every time he sets out to make a movie. He just here last week won his first Oscars period for directing, writing, and Best Picture for One Battle After Another, which is just one of his, just his most recent masterpiece. But his whole career is littered with them, right? Here's another guy who's never made a bad movie, ever. His first movie, Hard Eight, is really compelling and very well done. He follows that up with Boogie Nights, which I flat out say is, without question, a masterpiece. And I would have voted that the Oscar as the best picture of 1997. He follows it up with Magnolia. I think that's another masterpiece and among the best films of 1999. Punch Drunk Love. He says, I'm going to go out and make a comedy. I'm going to keep it to 90 minutes. He does. He proves that Adam Sandler can be an actual actor. And it's a great film, even though it's a kind of a surreal, weird comedy, has some very interesting, great things to say. And that's followed by his magnum opus, There Will Be Blood, which I believe is the greatest film of the 21st century and features arguably the greatest performance ever put on film by Daniel Day-Lewis as the protagonist, Daniel Plainview. That movie is amazing. I could watch it literally every week, never get tired of it. It is brilliant. The Master, Phantom Thread, those movies are amazing. And even when he falls a little bit short, it's not any kind of precipitous fall, right? He adapts Thomas Pynchon's Inherent Vice, and that kind of arguably falls flatter than any of his movies in terms of its reception, its box office. But he's hamstrung because he's trying to be faithful in his adaptation of this Pynchon novel. And Pynchon, for anybody out there who's never read him, he is not an author whose works are very easily adapted, if at all capable of being adapted into a successful film. Now, the other film that I would say overall is probably his weakest, or arguably his weakest, is Licorice Pizza, which still garnered him nominations for Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Screenplay. So even when he falls short, he's not even really falling short, right? Man, I wait with bated breath between projects for him, and he has become my favorite, I think, living director at this point, and I just really have incredible admiration for him as an artist. So that's my Mount Rushmore, right? Stanley Kubrick, Steven Spielberg, Francis Ford Coppola, Paul Thomas Anderson. I'm leaving off, obviously, some titans here, right? Orson Welles, who makes the greatest film of all time in his first effort out. The only guy capable of challenging Kubrick's genius. Obviously, Alfred Hitchcock, incredible body of work. Martin Scorsese, one of my other all-time favorite filmmakers. That was maybe the toughest call for me to leave off this list. I love his movies, and I would certainly say Taxi Driver is among the 10 greatest movies ever made, and Raging Bull is another out-and-out masterpiece with maybe the second greatest performance ever put on film by Robert De Niro as Jake LaMotta. So, yeah, that was a really tough call. I just think that Scorsese, unlike Spielberg, has more peaks and valleys. But hey, that's me. That's my taste. I would love to hear from all of you. What do you make of this? Who would be on your Mount Rushmore? Which ones of these would you agree with? Which ones do you think I'm crazy for picking, or at least misguided? So please sound off in the comments. Let me know. Let's have a good-natured and friendly debate. And until next time, I appreciate you showing up, supporting the channel, and we'll see you soon. All right? Take care. Bye-bye.